This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
I'm pleased to welcome everybody to this IIEA webinar. My name is Matt O'Neill. I'm Climate Project Lead here at the IIEA, and it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome our very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Hazel Malpet, Senior Research Coordinator at the International Food and Policy Research Institute. We've Dr. Jemima Njuku, I think I pronounced that right, Jemima, so please forgive me, Director of Gender, Women and Civil Society at African Development Bank Group, and Sonia Tanaka, Director of Programs and Innovation at Global 50/50, who's been, again, all three of them have been generous enough to take the time out of their very busy schedules to speak to us today. And again, it is a distinct pleasure for me to have. I will say Sonia, Hazel, and Jemima will speak for roughly between 15 to 20 minutes or so, and then we'll go to a Q&A with our audience. I'll ask a question or two after the presentation. I would just like to remind the audience, you'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. Please feel free to send any questions you might have throughout the session or as they occur, and we'll be able to come to them once Sonia, Hazel, and Jemima again has finished their presentation or reflections to the topic at hand. And a reminder that the presentation and Q&A are very much both on the record today for everybody. So let me formally introduce Sonia, Hazel, and Jemima, and then I'll hand it over to them in just reading their bios. Dr. Hazel Malpet is a Senior Research Coordinator at the International Food and Research Institute in Washington, D.C. She leads research, training, and technical assistance on women's empowerment in agricultural index, family of metrics, including the Women Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems. Her work focuses on gender, women's empowerment, agricultural health, nutrition, and mixed methods measurement. She's also played a key role in development of successive WEAI iterations and supports national statistics offices, CGIAR centres, and the development partners in applying empowerment metrics in impact assessments and policy processes. Before joining IFPRI, Hazel held the Herman Postdoctoral Fellowship in Gender and Economics at the University of Michigan and conducted research on gender, labour markets and data quality at the World Bank. She holds a PhD in economics from the American universities. And then I could go to Dr. Jemima Njuku. National of the Republic of Kenya, is the African Development Bank's Director of Gender, Women and Civil Society. She is responsible for providing intellectual and strategic leadership of the bank group's agenda on gender equality, women empowerment and civil society engagement, working across technical, geographic and institutional boundaries to support the delivery of inclusive development solutions. Her portfolio includes overseeing the implementation of economic and sector work on gender, women and civil society, including bank initiatives such as the AFAAA, which is working with partners, including financial institutions, to unlock billions of dollars to reduce the access to financial gap facing Africa's women and entrepreneurs. And then finally, but by no means anyway least, we have Sonia Tanaka. She is the Director of Programs and Innovation and a founding member at Global 50/50. She works to advance gender justice, equity and accountability in global health and beyond, with expertise in research, policy and strategic development. She was previously with the United Nations Agency leading its global AIDS response. So again, I'm sure you all can join welcoming me in such a very esteemed panel, and I will pass it off to you, Jemima. I believe you will offer the first reflections, followed by Sonia, and then Hazel. If I've got that wrong, please forgive me.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and it's a pleasure for me to be joining you today. As you mentioned, I'll start with an introduction of how the three of us came to start to do this work together on Global Food 50/50. Sonia will then present the results from the last report and index that we did. Hazel will share some of the experiences of the International Food Policy Research Institute being part of the organizations that are profiled in the report. And then I'll come back later, talk a little bit about what we are doing at the bank, how we are applying some of the lessons from the report at the bank, as well as make a call to action for all of you joining today in terms of how we can continue to do this work together. So let me just start by framing, this connection between gender and food systems. We know gender has a fundamental bearing on how power and privilege are distributed and how they're maintained in every society, in every institution, organization, community, and family around the world. We know gender norms determine how opportunities across the life course, including access to healthy food, with its attendant impact on health and well-being, and the likelihood that systems of land ownership, of resource allocation for food production will be distributed fairly. Now, from that overarching frame, we also know that gender acts as a gateway to revealing and understanding opportunity, expectations, and achievements along other socially constructed identities, whether you're thinking about class, geography, ethnicity, race, migration status, disability. And together, these constructions influence whether people, men, boys, women, and girls, including transgender people and people with non-binary gender identities, whether they can really realize their fundamental human rights, including their rights to health and to safe and nutritious food, to freedom from hunger. Now, in this way, gender justice and food justice are then closely intertwined. Gender inequalities are both a cause and an outcome of unsustainable food systems and unjust food access, production, marketing, promotion, and consumption. We know evidence shows that unequal access and rights to important resources in food systems undermines women's empowerment and productivity. On the other hand, unequal food systems also make women and girls more vulnerable to chronic food and nutrition insecurity, as well as to shock-induced food insecurity. So the Global Food 50/50 was born out of the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021. As the world's attention was focused on redesigning food systems to deliver safe and healthy food and livelihoods for all, it was equally important that we ensure that the human rights of half of its producers and consumers, women, are not denied. Because we know inadequate attention and action on gender prevents global food system organization from delivering results that leave no one behind and from building more equitable, innovative, and effective workplaces. We had focused a lot on the role of women producers in food production and in food systems, and not given enough attention to how food systems organizations were replicating systems of inequality. And it was clear that food system organizations must be part of creating a just and equitable food system. A food system in which women's roles moved from being invisible to being visible, one in which women's voices were heard and their leadership amplified, and one where the food system roles, responsibilities, and opportunities and choices available to women and girls, to men and boys, and to people with non-binary identities were not predetermined by prescriptive roles. And so the establishment of the Global Food 50/50 initiative was a response to this broader stakeholder demand for a global food system that's accountable for measurable and meaningful progress towards gender equality. Now, Sonia will talk about this more, but what then happened at that time, Hazel and I were part of the UN Food Systems Summit, providing leadership on gender equality across the multiple tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit. And Sonia Tanaka and her organization had been producing the Global Health 50/50 for years. And so we created this partnership between then the gender leadership of the UN Food Systems Summit and Global Health 50/50 to produce Global Food 50/50. And the goal was to have a global mechanism that would monitor progress and hold food system organizations accountable for achieving gender equality in leadership, in adopting gender equitable internal workplace policies, and implementing strategies that could advance progress towards gender just and equitable food systems. But this is not just an index or a report. It was meant and is still a powerful entry point for a cascade of changes throughout food systems, because it urges actors and organizations to really question how systems of power, global, national, and local, interpersonal, and institutional, how they undermine an equitable and sustainable global food system, and urges them to really assess how socioeconomic and political structures interact with one another to drive vulnerability and marginalization for those with less power. But more importantly is that it urges and drives organizations to really implement a combination of gender responsive programming, gender equitable institutional and diversity in their policies and in the way they work, so that we can achieve this twin goal of gender equality and food systems transformation in a way that works for everybody, in a way that leaves no one behind. So that's sort of the broader origin of Global Food 50/50. And now I'll hand over to Soja to talk more about how it works, what are the results that we have seen over the years, and then over to Hazel to talk about how it's driving change within organizations.
Thanks so much, Jemima. I will just wait a moment. Thank you for the slides. Well, thanks, Jemima, for that fantastic introduction. And it's really exciting to be here and to be talking about Global Food 50/50. I haven't had the opportunity to talk about Global Food 50/50 for a while, and it was a really exciting partnership for us in really piloting and showing the power of this tool to extend in different spaces, different sectors, different issues that we all care deeply about. And so just backing up in terms of who we are, Global 50/50, I assume many of you aren't familiar with our organization. We're a small independent research and impact think tank and to advance gender justice around the world. As Jemima mentioned, we've been delivering health reports on a sample of about 200 organizations that are active in global health over the past 8 years. And the data that's reported in those reports is also presented in our health index, where you can go and kind of explore organizational performance by year and compare across sectors, across variables. And it's from this larger sample that we derived the Global Food 50/50 data. If we can go to the next slide. So from a mapping of those 200 organizations, we identified which were active in the food and nutrition space, and defining about 51 organizations that were both active in health and food and nutrition, and looked at those organizations across the variables that we look at in the Global Health 50/50 reports, and really across two interlinked dimensions of inequality. And that's inequality of opportunity in career pathways inside of organizations, and inequality in who benefits from the global food system. So both kind of the internal workings of the organization, as well as how they're delivering on their mandates out in the world. And we really are operating on this hypothesis that these two dimensions are very interlinked, that equality of opportunity, equality of access to leadership results in stronger, more diverse leadership, and that results in better performance of the organization, better policies, and ultimately better outcomes, whether it's health or food and nutrition for all people. We also, in Global Food 50/50 in this partnership is very much a reflection of our understanding at Global 50/50 and really the origin of our organization, which is that evidence alone doesn't speak for itself, but it really, how do we activate that evidence and that data? What kind of partnerships do we enter into? How do we present that data and really try to encourage change through transparency, through accountability, and through partnership. So next slide. These are the variables that we look at and when we assess these 51 organizations. So we're interested in these kind of 4 buckets, and again, drawn from the larger Global Health 50/50 report. We are, the first bucket is around commitments to redistribute power. So we look at whether an organization has a public commitment to gender equality across its work, and that can relate to its workplace or to its programs. We also look for a definition of gender. This we really see as, in a context where words hold a great deal of power these days. We are very much interested in how an organization conceives of the concept of gender. Is it the same as sex? Is the gender as a social construct, gender as a lens to which to view power? Is that understood by the organization, and thus does the organization's implementation of gender and gender responsive policies and practices reflect that understanding of gender? We're interested in the policies inside of the workplace in terms of those that tackle power and privilege imbalances. So can we find evidence that there's a gender equality policy? Can we find evidence that there's a diversity and inclusion policy, or a policy that influences who gains access to board membership? And specifically, we're looking not just at whether there's a commitment to these principles in the workplace, but are there actually measures for the organization to achieve the goals that they've set out in these policies? So can we see that are there targets? Are there mentorship programs? Are there employee reference resource groups? Are there different measures to act on and to hold themselves accountable to these policies? And the third bucket is on outcomes. So who holds power and enjoys privilege? We are interested in measuring gender parity, progress towards gender parity in senior management and governing bodies. What is the identity of the gender of the CEO? Or what's the identity of the CEO and the board chair in terms of gender and nationality? And then finally, as kind of our proxy indicator around whether an organization is applying a gender lens to their programmatic work, we look to see if an organization has a policy to sex disaggregate their M&E data. So it's kind of the first step into shaping a gender responsive program. Do they first understand who they're reaching? Next slide. So quickly on our methods, we do our best to apply a very rigorous methodological approach. Our data is collected by 2 researchers working independently, and then reviewed by a 3rd researcher to address any discrepancies and arrive at a consensus. We are very concerned with transparency. We see that as an integral part of accountability. So the data that we assess is really primarily drawn from public sources only, and really using the organization's website as the primary source of information. And in terms of validity, part of our process is engaging organizations at kind of each step in our data collection and validation and publication process. So we certainly don't want to catch organizations off guard. We want them to be part of the process. We share the data as we are collecting it with organizations to review, to let us know what we've got wrong, to add, to challenge. And this we find is both important in terms of the accuracy of the data that we collect, but it also provides a really valuable channel of communication with organizations, as we're interested ultimately in opening a space for dialogue and supporting organizations to strengthen their gender policies and practices, having that kind of bilateral conversation with organizations before results are produced has for us been a great kind of engagement step in measuring some change in policy and practice, even before reports get published. We look at 51 organizations, as I said, and these are drawn from a number of different sectors, the multilaterals, the bilaterals, NGOs, private sector, some regional bodies, UN funders, PPPs, faith-based organizations, and one research organization. Next slide. So I've put a couple of our findings from the 2023 report. I probably should have started by saying that we produced this report 3 years in a row, 21, 22, and 23. We've since had no funding to continue, unfortunately. But I've put the findings from that final report here. I've also put in a final slide. Hazel and Jemima, you'll be interested to see as well that I ran the data for this set of organizations with our 2025 data. So I can also show you what's happened in the last 2 years. It's not a great story, as you can probably imagine. But what we were finding in 2023 was that public commitment to gender equality was very high. Only 2 of the 51 organizations that we were assessing lacked a public commitment to gender equality. So not so surprising, I suppose, this sample of organizations that are invested in food and nutrition are also certainly aware of the role of gender equality and gender inequality in terms of enabling or hampering their efforts towards food security. Next slide. Then we see kind of a lower proportion of organizations that have a definition of gender that aligns with global norms, that recognizes gender as a social construct. But we're seeing increases. So from 2021, it was at 53% of organizations were clear about what they understood gender to be. And that went up to 69% in 2023. So quite a notable bump in performance there. The next finding. So in terms of the workplace policies that we were assessing, on the left side, those are the gender equality policies. So do organizations have a policy in place with specific measures in terms of how they're advancing gender equality in their workplace? And that number increased from 69% to 76% in just those 3 years that we were measuring this variable. And on the right side, the diversity and inclusion policy saw a big jump from 53% to 73%. And that aligns with the larger sample of global health, 2,200 global health organizations. Post-2020, really, 2020 was a year of a lot of, say, reckoning and growing awareness around racial inequality and structural racism across kind of the world. And that was reflected in the kind of the workplace, including in the organizations that we were assessing. So we saw a big jump in the D&I policies in those couple of years. And then the next finding, the next one, finding 3B. In the 2023 report, we looked at, we did a deep dive into care policies. And so each year we do try to bring in a thematic focus in addition to the core variables that we assess. In 2023, that thematic focus was care policies, and recognizing that the care responsibilities have quite an impact on the quality of career outcome and career pathways for women and men. And so we were interested to see what organizations were offering around paid care leave, around childcare support, unpaid care, for longer periods of absence. And we found that these kinds of care policies were actually quite scarce. And next slide. So these are the variables we looked at in terms of who's sitting inside of the leadership positions, who's holding power in these organizations. We saw kind of a variation in progress, while senior management bodies had the proportion of organizations that had fewer than 44% women decreased. So there were more organizations with more women. However, boards, we saw the inverse relationship where boards that had fewer women actually increased in the few years that we were measuring this variable. And then similarly for the next finding, I think we saw kind of the next slide, please. Yes. Again, kind of very little progress in terms of who's sitting in the highest levels of leadership, and basically no increase from 2021 to 23 in the proportion of women CEOs, and an actual reduction in the proportion of board chairs that were women between 21 and 23. Then our final finding, 6. Again, I'm kind of running through these. There are many more insights that can be derived in the report, and as I had said, these findings are there are a few years old. I think the value, though, of sharing these even now is to demonstrate the kinds of insights that we were able to generate through this process. This final finding, 6, was on whether organizations have a policy to sex disaggregate data. So are they taking that very preliminary step to understanding who they're reaching and thus being able to tailor gender responsive policies and programs? And we found that 68% of the nonprofit organizations did have such policies, far fewer for the for-profits. And which is somewhat understandable. The nonprofit organizations, though, that we did expect that this number would be higher, that for this really preliminary kind of information for gender responsive programs wasn't available for about a third of the nonprofit organizations in the sample. So then the next slide, as I mentioned, I quickly ran the data. We produced our report for the global health sample, the 200 organizations, a larger sample, in 2025. That was, we launched this mid last year. And this came on the heels of executive orders coming out of the United States. The US administration had basically banned words like, for the gender terminology, banned DEI programs, had this real chilling effect around the world for organizations that received federal funding, but also for those that didn't receive US federal funding. And so for the first time in the years that we had been measuring these variables, so for the health sample since 2018, for this food sample since 2021, we saw quite a notable downturn in all of the variables that we measure between 2024 and 2025. And that was very much reflects the this kind of rapid removal of language from organizations' websites. And we had a lot of conversations with organizations in the lead up to our publication of this report last year. And, on one side, we heard that their DEI and gender equality are values that are embedded in organizations. The work will continue behind the scenes. To survive, organizations had to remove such language from their websites, the public-facing websites. But there was a lot of debate around whether organizations were able to stand their ground and difficult decisions that organizations had to face in in light of the U.S. administration's decision to really defund a lot of these programs and aid more generally. So a couple more slides. I'll hurry my way through these. So a couple of the responses and results, because we is saying we're interested in generating evidence, but we don't want to stop there. It's really to encourage change and gender responsive impact across organizations. We expect organizations that are active in this global health, food, and nutrition space to really be the leaders on these values and these norms. And so we do hear that that the global food and the larger global health 50/50 reports have increased awareness. Organizations agreed that the reports encourage them to consider gender and fairness in their workplace and programmatic work. We know that there are several NGOs that are incorporating their performance in these indices into leadership KPIs. We've heard from staff and from CEOs that the report and their performance in these reports has led to new policies being put in place and put into the public domain. We also know that donors are using this information. So SIDA, for example, from Sweden, has used the index to hold grantees, their grantees that show up in our index, to account and have kind of conversations with those grantees and ask for management responses to the findings in the Global 50/50 Index. And demands for more. So such as Global Food 50/50, we've also moved into the justice space in response to interests from funders. We've also worked with a country partner to pilot the methodology at the national level. And so there does seem to be there's interest in applying the methodology, which can be applied across, I'd said at the start, really across kind of any issue and any sample of organizations, to measure gender norms and gender policies and practices. So with that, I think there might just be a final slide around where you can learn a little bit more. We have this index, the Global Food 50/50 Index, the performance of organizations. You can dig a little bit deeper into the performance via the organizational profiles. There's a policy repository if organizations are interested in learning more about the good practice that we've found. There are tools for change along each one of the variables that we assess. There's a law and justice and kind of gender more generally glossary as well. So a number of tools as we continue to try to support organizations to strengthen their gender-related policies and practices. Thank you.
Great. So I think I can jump in. Thanks, Sonia, for that great summary of what we've learned over these 3 years we've been producing this report. I found it also super interesting how fragile some of these gains are, like what we've seen over the years. We've seen improvements, and for the first time now we're seeing these backtrack, and that's worrisome. But I think the lesson I'm taking back is that because we're monitoring it, we can see where these things are moving, and I think that's really important. And so what I wanted to share, I'm not going to take too long, but I think following the 3 reports we've produced, I work for a research institute that works on food policy, and so we're coming to this partnership with the food, agri-food system kind of domain expertise. And one of the things, every time we would launch a report, one question kept coming back up again and again, is that if this assessment is so important, why isn't IFPRI included? IFPRI is my organization. It's like you keep telling everybody else to look at these standards and hold themselves accountable, and yet we who work in the food system are not part of it. Of course, the practical reason was that we were not in the original sample of Global Health 50/50, and that was the original constraint. But 3 years in a row, we keep getting with this question. And honestly, it was a very fair question, right? Because it felt quite inconsistent and, dare I say, hypocritical to be advocating for transparency, for accountability, for gender equitable leadership across the food system, and then not holding ourselves to the same standards. So, we're an institute full of researchers. We believe in evidence, we believe in measurement, and we know what gets measured gets improved. And so it became very clear that we needed to be part of this sample, and not just symbolically, but because we genuinely wanted to have benchmarks to understand how are we doing. Now, so in 2024, so the last data set that was used to produce the report 2023, in the 2024 cycle, we were included, IFPRI was included. And when we first got our first scorecard, it was a shock. It was, we've been working on the gender sphere for so long. We kind of maybe taken it for granted a little bit. We've been a leader in doing research on gender. We have, elaborate methods around this. We thought we were kind of had our eye on the ball. But when we got our assessment, the Institute was a low performer. And this is all public, right? It's, if you go to those profiles that Sonia shared, you can look at IFPRI and see our actual score and look at the breakdown. But this came as a shock to leadership in my institute because, as I said, all along we thought we were paying attention. But what this methodology, this assessment forced us to do is to confront some of these oversights, some of the gaps that we haven't fully acknowledged, that we have missing policies, we have limited transparency, maybe we have a public commitment, but we haven't been monitoring or tracking them as carefully as we should have been. And that comes through in the scorecard, right? And so what made this assessment really powerful is that it was independent, right? So independently verifiable. It was rigorous. It has that very rigorous methodology, and it's based on publicly available data. And so this was super helpful for me because one of the hats I wear in IFPRI is I'm also the chair of the IFPRI Gender Task Force. For me, it was useful for internal advocacy to kind of talk to leadership and start conversations about, okay, what can we do concretely to improve our performance? And here are the gaps. Here's where we're doing well, and here's where we're not doing well. And talking to a bunch of researchers, that's evidence that they can actually understand, and they say, oh wow, when confronted with data, there was no denying it that we had to make some changes. And so the following year, we actually improved somewhat. We had a couple of indicators that we were able to move. Some of the ones that were easier to do, of course, like, board representation, senior leadership representation. It takes a bit of time to change some of those things, but some of the easier things we were able to move very quickly. And so for me, that was great. We moved from low to moderate performer, for example. I'm super curious to see what the next year will bring. Whether because some of the other changes are a bit harder. So I don't know. I'm hoping for at least same result, if not better, but let's see what the data tells us. And so now this has become one of our internal kind of metrics for our own organizational practice. And so I think I'm super grateful to Sonia for making that suggestion to IFPRI. And I think my leadership is also now much more committed now that they have like specific indicators to look at. I think it's really been very, very helpful. Now, unfortunately, that's just one organization, right? Our goal was to expand this to the full, broad kind of landscape of organizations working in the food system, and not just limited to 50. Obviously, 50 is not very many, or even 52 with IFPRI included. It's not very many. And we also wanted to expand a little bit some of the indicators. So maybe let me pass on now to Jemima to tell us a bit about what we can do next to move this work forward.
Thank you, Hazel. And let me see whether I can say all this in the next 5 minutes so that we have a chance for some questions. I do want first to reflect on my current work at the bank, because what this report has also made me do is reflect on gender equality within the African Development Bank with the lens of the indicators that Sonia has presented, and basically looking at three questions: how the bank has made its commitment to gender equality and where that is reflected within the bank. The second one on how we are translating this commitment in terms of our own institutional behavior, practices, and policies as a bank. And lastly, in how we are ensuring that our work, the investments that the bank makes, actually have an impact on gender equality and have an impact on the lives of women and girls. And I just want to say a few things. First, on the first question around the commitment, that we have a 10-year strategy. And we believe that empowerment of women for us is both a social commitment, but also an economic imperative for the continent, that it's so central to the continent's economic transformation. And so we have a 10-year strategy that is really a public commitment of where the gender equality and women's empowerment sits very centrally in this 10-year strategy. And then we have a gender strategy that has key priorities and key targets that everybody is committed to. And that strategy then translates into institutional commitments and key performance indicators across the sectors in the bank. In terms of the institutional commitment, we recognize that it has to begin with the institution, and how we reflect this through leadership action, through accountability mechanisms, but also institutional cultural transformation. So we have a diversity and inclusion strategy where we are advancing equitable recruitment, career development, leadership representation, and pay equity. So a couple of very clear, distinct things that we pursue as a bank. The bank currently has 39% women's representation. We are committed to achieving parity across all levels. We participate in the economic dividends for gender equality qualification, the EDGE. And currently, we have class level 2 certification on EDGE. But one of the things that I have really loved about the bank, and that continues to be a really key feature of the institutional commitment, is the flexible work arrangements that the bank has that actually allows a lot of flexibility amongst in the staff in how we work, as well as a very strong women's leadership network where there is very targeted initiatives towards women who work at the bank. Now, the third question on how we are ensuring that the bank's investments actually lead to improvements in gender equality and the lives of women and girls across the continent. The first thing is we mainstream gender equality across all of our operations. We operate on a gender marker system, and currently 100% of our operations that go to governments are categorized as gender marker system category 1 or 2. That means they have an direct impact on women and girls and on gender equality. Second is expanding access to finance for women entrepreneurs. We have a program called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa that aims to unlock 5 billion in capital for women entrepreneurs in the continent to close the 42 billion gap that we see. In the last 4 years, we've unlocked $3.1 billion just going to women, small and medium enterprises. The third one is on supporting policy and institutional reforms for gender responsive governance, using our convening power in the continent to ensure that governments actually implement policies that lead to gender equality. And then fourth, strengthening accountability for results. We're tracking gender outcomes in access to finance, in job creation, in productivity, in women's participation in leadership and decision making. And those indicators are key parts of not just the bank's overall performance, but also performance of individual staff within the bank, that we can actually track these outcomes. And so what we really want to make sure is that gender equality is not auxiliary to what we do, but it is actually quite central to what we do. So a quick call to action based on what we have said today. First, as both Sonia and Hazel have said, the last time we did this report was in 2023, not because it's not important, not because it's not impactful, but because of resources. And so we want this index and report to remain independent. I think that's been very central to the way we do this, that it is independent. And so we are always seeking for multiple donors, multiple supporters to support the analysis and the report. And so that's one thing for you to think about. But the second thing and most fundamental thing is to also take those indicators that you've seen and reflect them on your organizations to see, just like Hazel has talked about, the process that IFPRI has gone through. How does your organization fare in this? Even just looking at, some of the indicators, where does your organization fall, and how can you do better in these indicators? So resources to continue this work, but to really all of us reflect on how our organization's doing in terms of these indicators, and how can we continue to do better in terms of making sure that food systems organizations are equitable, they are accountable, and that their leadership, their policies really reflect the diversity we see in food systems themselves.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.